Chinese President Xi Jinping concluded his visit to India and Nepal on Sunday, where he met with the leaders of both countries. What was on the agenda and what are the major takeaways from the bilateral meetings between China and its South Asian neighbors? Also on the program today, China has released a white paper on food security. So how does it plan to successfully feed 1.4 billion people with growing demands? I'm Zhong Shi in for Liu Xin today. Welcome to The Point. First up tonight, Chinese President Xi Jinping concluded his visit to India and Nepal on Sunday. Several issues were on the agenda, including infrastructure, trade, and foreign policy. Warm words were expressed by all leaders, and 20 cooperation agreements between China and Nepal were signed. But with a large trade deficit between India and China and border concerns among South Asian countries unresolved, what tangible advances were made during the visit? And does China look into its neighbors as the U.S. continues to be an unpredictable and unstable economic partner? Joining me to discuss this are Gong, professor of economics at the University of International Business and Economics, and Einar Tangen, a current affairs commentator. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start with India. Two aspects I want to talk to you about on this trip. First, it was an informal setting, and then it took place in Mamallapuram, famous for cultural heritage and maritime trade. Einar, let me start with you. How important are the choreography and the staging of these meetings?
Well, I think it's very important because, remember, the majority of people who are watching this, both in India and China, they're not as familiar with all of the detailed things. So seeing two leaders who are obviously engaged, there's like 7 or 8 handshakes, in public while they were just the first day that they were there, and they were talking. And very different from the last informal meeting where Modi did most of the talking and she was listening. This was a real exchange. So having two leaders who are now firmly in control of their respective countries, having a real understanding of how each one thinks and what their strategic goals are, very important in this very difficult relationship.
A lot of people would say this is a continuation of what they did in Wuhan last year, which was also an informal meeting. Professor Gong, your take?
I think this comes at a very critical time, as we all know that India has abrogated Article 370 in its constitution and has stripped the autonomous status of Indian controlled part of Kashmir, and there's sort of a tension flaring up between Pakistan and India. But China wants to maintain a good relationship with both countries. We have a historic, very strong relationship with Pakistan. We also have a thriving
all-weather friends.
All-weather friends, exactly.
Like
yeah, that's right. But we also have a very thriving economic relationship with India. The trade between China and India is rising rapidly. China's investments in India are also rising. So, China wants to have a peaceful relationship with both countries, and doesn't want to have these tensions flaring up in that part of the world.
That's exactly right. Xi Jinping was doing his utmost to thread the needle on an existing long-term relationship while he was trying to develop a new relationship. And I think some of that was lost, especially on Indian TV, where they were talking more about the fact that China is obviously siding with Pakistan. I said, but have you read the actual thing he said? And the last line is that this should be settled bilaterally. China is not trying to intervene. They're just trying to say that regional peace and an Asian century will depend on making sure that people can talk to each other, not fire guns.
Right. And Imran Khan had a chance to meet with President Xi before his India trip. What were the expectations there?
Well, the general expectation is that this unilateral action on the Indian government's part is not going to cause a significant change of status quo in that part of the world. That China and India are still going to keep developing our relationships. At the same time, we hope that India and Pakistan are going to be maintaining a peaceful relationship. This is particularly important given the fact that both countries are nuclear power states. So I think, in general, China's position on this change is actually very consistent. It's in sync with most of the international opinions. That is, we should, no country should take unilateral action to change the status quo and escalate tensions. More important, escalate tensions. So I think this issue has to be resolved via dialogue between the two countries, definitely through peaceful negotiation dialogues, as opposed to deploying troops and forces.
Well, China has been handling this with caution. Einar, your take on how difficult a position is it for China?
It's difficult as they try to maneuver with India. India takes a very emotional stance towards this, as does Pakistan. Both sides are insisting that the other one is wrong. India says, look, we're doing what we need to do, and it's an internal matter. Pakistan said this is, in essence, a gauntlet of war. A lot of harsh rhetoric. Hopefully it does not come to anything. But there's now this kind of concerted PR campaign going on by both sides. Pakistan is appealing to the international press and saying, look, we've been victimized. Look at what India is doing. India is saying, listen, we're doing what is necessary for our country. So they're competing on these kind of narratives. And unfortunately, no one wants to really take sides on this. Pakistan is somewhat isolated out there, but India has attracted some negative attention on this issue as well.
Yeah, shifting to another topic that's been very important for the meeting, trade. One of the outcomes was that the two sides agreed to establish a trade platform. India runs a trade deficit of over $50 billion with China. Professor Gong, how keen is India to redress that trading relationship?
Well, that's a concern. I think India, at one side, wants to have more investment from China, but on the other hand, we're starting to see more and more Chinese manufactured goods going into India, especially related with China's investments there. I know, for example, some companies like semi-heavy equipment. India is a developing country. It's building itself, and so you need a lot of infrastructure equipment. Semi-heavy equipment is doing very well. Xiaomi is another example.
They're building a factory.
The smartphone industry is heavily invested in India. Another example I can give is the solar panel in the manufacturing industry. We have companies going to India. India is developing its infrastructure, including electricity. So there's a lot of demand for solar power, and Chinese companies just dominate in that space. So the trade, I think, between China and India is a lot of potential. I mean, India about the same size population as China, but it's only 1/5 of China's GDP size. So there's a lot of potential for growth.
And trade-wise...
But wait a second. I mean, one thing we have to acknowledge here, and it's the same with the U.S., the reason they have a trade deficit is because people want to buy Chinese goods. They buy the Chinese goods not because they're Chinese, but because they're cheaper.
Right.
So if you put tariffs on these goods, all you're doing is, in essence, making you're creating inflation. If they want the goods, they have to pay more for them. It doesn't stop them, all right? They can easily go somewhere else. It's like the U.S., I mean, the trade deficit has actually increased under Donald Trump by 0.8%. So it's not going down. It's the appetite of the consumer to have these goods, which is ultimately there. And they're doing it based on market and price and value. So attacking a country because they're supplying you things that the people in your country want, I don't know if that's valid.
Let's assume India doesn't want to go the way the U.S. has, and how does it redress this relationship?
They have to export. We've talked about it. They would concentrate. They say, look, let our pharmaceutical companies in.
And also mineral resources, and service as well, I think.
Yeah, services. But there's
yeah.
often a problem because if you're an American or British and you're talking to somebody from India, it's understandable. And the same is true for somebody who speaks English in China. But between English-speaking Chinese and English-speaking Indian, sometimes there's a difficulty translating, communicating.
I don't think India is going to follow the United States to wage a trade war against China, because India is a participating member of the RCEP negotiation. And currently, all indications point to the fact that RCEP negotiation is a big promise to be concluded, hopefully by the end of the year. And India reportedly has made some concessions. I mean, one of the major concerns for India is precisely because by joining RCEP, there will be exports coming from China into India. That's the biggest concern. I think India's position has softened a little bit, and I think eventually we are going to have a RCEP agreement, and India is going to be part of that. That's my conjecture.
And when people are looking at RCEP, what is different from TPP? Basically, it's the amount of set aside. Countries are basically, as I said, 5% of our economy we can protect. And this is very politically important in areas like Japan and things like that. So, although they're in TPP and they've signed on to something different. But for India, it's very, very necessary in different parts like Indonesia. Everyone has agreed that you give it. Eventually, they go down. Year by year, the idea is you get down to as low as possible.
It's country-specific.
Big factor in your decision-making process.
But this is the kind of thing where Xi and Modi can sit down and just talk about this, and it's so important in terms of giving direction.
I want to bring Nepal into the discussion as well, which was the second destination for President Xi. Why now, after 23 years, Einar?
Well, no one was trying to do it. There's a very tricky part of Nepal. India doesn't like it when there's a lot of activity in Nepal because of these traditional areas of influence. All right, and there's already a lot of push and pull, and Nepal's in between. Now, they're trying to benefit from this by balancing this relationship, saying to India, look, China's offering us, what are you offering us? But I think the big takeaway from Nepal was this railway project, because remember, it might be difficult for India to join the Belt and Road Initiative, but if there is a railhead that goes to the border with India, and there is now a railroad being planned that would go through India, in essence, you have the infrastructure. Because remember, it's not about being under the Belt and Road Initiative. It's about infrastructure and trade.
Talking about influence and jostling there between these countries, Professor Gong, how worried is India that now Nepal is increasingly turning to China for help and ultimately access to other parts of the world?
The Nepal issue is a classic case of geopolitics. India considers Nepal being part of its sphere of influence. In other words, Nepal is a landlocked country. Its only route for trade is currently through India. So things going through India and things could be quite expensive in Nepal. And India definitely derives economic interest and economic benefits from this trade relationship. Now Nepal wants to, from Nepal's perspective, it definitely wants to have another option here in dealing with two parties, right? So I think the idea that China is going to build a sort of infrastructure connection to Nepal certainly cuts into some interests of India, and it certainly is going to be worrying. So I think it's
such a poor nation. I don't think that India is deriving that much benefit.
All right, gentlemen, I did not nearly get enough from you on this topic, but we're running out of time. Thank you so much, Einar and Professor Gong, for your input.